For over 39 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Repka, this is BILD Situation Room. And we start again with impressive images of the massive attacks using small drones on a total of 4 airfields of the Russian strategic bomber fleet. About a week ago, last Sunday, Ukraine came up with this, from their perspective, quite brilliant idea to transport these small quadcopter drones all the way to Belaya by strategically using trucks. For example, driving them near Irkutsk to Olenya near Murmansk and attacking 2 more bases around Moscow with them. We knew or had known beforehand that numerous Tupolev 95 strategic bombers were attacked and destroyed. These recordings are brand new. They were just released yesterday by the SPU, and they show us what had already been mentioned earlier, specifically that Tu-22s were also targeted and attacked. So these are also strategic bombers from the fleet, originating from the 1980s as well. And we can see here in Olenya that several of these aircraft are already on fire, and this drone is now actively hunting for its next target. This situation shows us once again. We saw that it was a truck involved from which the drones subsequently took off. There was this double floor or double roof structure where these drones were precisely positioned inside. And we can also see, and I think this is relatively important, that of course not all drones have struck. We keep seeing fires here, as noted earlier, along the way. This means we can assume that some of the drones crashed on their way there. Maybe they were shot down. We've at least seen some Russian footage showing machine guns being used here. So, with twin-barreled machine guns. Some Russians tried to shoot them down. Now we're seeing here, as we take a look around, yes, there's fire, and at least 2 planes are currently burning. But we also see at least 6 planes here, Tu-22Ms, that are not yet on fire. And so the task at hand now is to target and attack these next incoming Ukrainian drones here. We have visual confirmation overall of roughly 40 impacts, so around 40 in total observed. Final approaches, and here we see it ending with the drone positioned right in front of the aircraft. However, based on the satellite images currently available to us, the only confirmation we've received up to this specific moment is that there are approximately just about 20 destroyed aircraft on the Russian side. And that's just normal. You have to see it realistically that only about 50% of the drones actually hit their target, explode, and cause a fire in that manner, as typically expected under such conditions. So there's always a number of drones not working. How they should do it. As I said, these recordings again from Olenya. This was truly the most massive attack we've witnessed. Even if just 20 strategic bombers were lost by Russia, it's the heaviest blow ever to their strategic bomber fleet that has ever taken place. The days since the attack have been marked by massive Russian strikes. Some call them retaliatory or revenge attacks. Others say, no, the attacks are actually less severe than they could be. We know that Tu-160s are now being deployed, those modern strategic bombers, and they are currently in action. The Tu-95s are being deployed, and some Russian bloggers are also complaining that there simply aren't as many planes available to carry out these retaliatory strikes. That means it's an extremely fine line here. Some argue that Putin might have acted less aggressively if it hadn't been provoked from the Ukrainian side. Others say Putin would have attacked even more strongly. We've already seen the trend in recent weeks with the Shahed drones that they're increasing 200, 300 a night. Ukrainian analysts predict 500 a night soon. So it's really hard to assess what's exactly happening here. Yes, and what it entails. We know all of this began with Russia's illegal and internationally wrongful attack on Ukraine. We have footage from Lutsk captured last week, which clearly shows how Russia is attacking the region using Kh-101. Cruise missiles. Those are pretty devastating images, one has to say, because Lutsk is a city in western Ukraine. And now we're seeing the sequence unfold. Here it is. These cruise missiles striking the target. Interestingly, they deploy decoys during their final approach. This means so-called flares, presumably due to Ukrainian air defense presence. But this air defense is entirely missing. That means we can confidently assume there's no missile defense here, one after another. Here it's clearly visible once more. Another cruise missile is approaching. As we know, they fly relatively low at 50 to 200 meters in altitude, then climb to about 2 kilometers, and then the target approach comes with particularly high speed, essentially from above into the respective target. We know that, for example, residential buildings were hit here in Lutsk, a hotel was hit, and that critical infrastructure, including in the military sector of Ukraine, has likely also been affected here. And that is truly quite dramatic for Ukraine when you see it, because these attacks on critical infrastructure are now occurring multiple times a day. Russia is currently using between 200 and 300 kamikaze drones every day, as mentioned, along with cruise missiles and rockets in the single to double-digit range. We also have additional footage, in this case from Kharkiv, that shows how the terror sometimes targets only the civilian population. These recordings clearly indicate that the strikes launched from the Russian side were aimed at military targets, though they only managed to partially hit their intended objectives. The footage from Kharkiv shows us something much worse, how these kamikaze drones strike here at night. These are entirely civilian targets, high-rise buildings where only civilians reside. And we can see one after another now here on the right side exclusively in these residential blocks, in these apartment buildings, partly into the roofs. When these Shahed drones strike, it is sheer terror. It is solely attempts by the Russian Federation to depopulate Kharkiv here, to force people to flee, to evacuate, to say, yes, as long as you defend yourselves, as long as your government acts against our invasion, we will attack you in this way. And these are, as mentioned, attacks on civilian populations, but also on power plants. There were power outages again, and critical infrastructure in Kharkiv was also hit once more. We're witnessing these truly devastating images every single day. Yes, every single day there are dead and wounded among the civilian population. And all of this shows us that Russia is likely completely indifferent to whether one attacks their strategic bomber or not. They alone, with kamikaze drones and cruise missiles, want to ramp up the pressure on Ukraine even more intensely, in the hope that, at some point, the government or the population will be bombed into submission and forced to capitulate. So far, it's been the exact opposite. 60% of Ukrainians still firmly support continuing this war, even in the face of Russia's harsh attacks. And another video from Kiev shows us a particularly insidious tactic of the Russian army. Over recent days, we've frequently heard of so-called double-tap attacks. So, double strikes on targets that have already been attacked once, aiming to target and kill the firefighters, the rescuers, as well as all the other helpers working on the ground. Russia has succeeded in this. At least 4 firefighters have died in Kyiv. 15 were injured a few days ago. We're taking a look at one of these attacks, in my opinion, truly dramatic footage. Filmed from a house across the street, here we see this massive wall of fire, this cloud, steadily rising and working its way upward. And now we see, this isn't the first attack, but now we see it from above. And in this raging inferno, the fire brigade is already at work and had been actively battling the flames for some time. Now we're seeing it here for the very first time. This is the ladder with, yes, the firefighter positioned on top, and the firefighting operations were already actively underway when the next wave of Shahed drones struck this precise location. You can also see it relatively well. These aren't secondary explosions. You also hear, well, only one of these explosions, but these are the typical images of a lot of flames and relatively little explosive power from these Shahed 136, or as the Russians call them, Geran 2 drones. Here you can see it quite clearly again. The fire truck is already down there and has been trying to extinguish the flames. It's unclear whether this attack led to firefighter fatalities. Here is another emergency vehicle, but it is clear that the Russians have repeatedly carried out these double-tap attacks in recent days, thereby killing various rescue personnel not only in Kyiv. Ukraine has also not remained inactive in recent days, continuing to attack strategic Russian targets far behind the front lines, such as this Lukoil facility of the state-owned Russian conglomerate Lukoil in Nizhny Novgorod. That means this is a city situated several kilometers east of Moscow. Here, fuel facilities and refinery plants continue to be actively targeted by Ukrainian forces, not only in Nizhny Novgorod, but also in Saratov. At the Engels base, a portion of the kerosene used for the strategic bombers there has been burning for several days. And we know that Ukraine is also targeting other objectives, for example, factories producing drones, factories manufacturing components for Putin's war industry. And in this regard, Ukraine is relentlessly firing every single day and night. It's absolutely crucial to note somewhere between 50 and 150 drones at Russia. The difference is we don't have any civilian casualties in Russia, but we do have exactly these images. We are focusing our attacks strictly on military, or at least on structures that directly serve Putin's military. From the large-scale strategic attacks on Ukraine and Russia, we turn to the battlefield, first heading to the southeast of Ukraine, to the Donetsk region, where we must note that more towns have fallen under Russian control, and Ukraine continues to struggle in finding the means to effectively halt the Russian advance in Donetsk. They are slowing them down, they are killing many of them. However, the front is not coming to a halt, but continues to move towards central Ukraine. We have the first footage from Fedorivka, and this footage once again shows us how Russia is proceeding. These are Russian propaganda recordings that clearly show us how this attack was carried out. We first see the multiple rocket launches, then witness this explosion in the city. And of course, these are all attacks that cannot distinguish between civilian and military targets, but rather everything was simply attacked. Now we essentially see after this initial bombardment that they are specifically targeting individual houses. That's probably either fixed-wing aircraft, drones, or artillery being deployed to strike individual buildings where Ukrainian soldiers are suspected to be inside. And then we'll see those familiar scenes once again, just like before. The Russian flags are being raised, in this case flags that clearly indicate which specific units, among others, are involved there and deliberately choose to act once more, as we've seen before. The Russians are like, they go out every time and take a new street, occupy a new house in front of which they stand, just to show this part of the place too, this specific section of, in this case, Fedorivka, is now under our control. And the whole thing is extremely dramatic for the Ukrainians because in the southeast of Donetsk, they have essentially lost all the remaining territory there in the past few months. Since the fall of Kurakova in the winter, they have advanced more than 50 kilometers westward here, now reaching the borders of Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk, which are the southern and central Ukrainian regions. And we can see in the background there, that's Komar. It's effectively the final city remaining under Ukrainian control in the southern region of Donetsk Oblast. And let's take a look at all of this on the map. As I said, overall truly challenging footage. We can see we've now focused on Velika Novosilka, a nearby town that was also taken during the offensive operations back in January. And we can see, however, these advances actually extend in all directions. We have one advance here directly to the west, where one arrives at Selenipol and at Vilnopol. So around this general area, roughly here, is where the oblast border to Dnipropetrovsk lies. But at the same time, we can see what we just observed, that Fedorivka has been captured, and that there are now also battles taking place in Komar. Komar, the final city before reaching the oblast border, and here in Oleksivka as well. And near Bahatir, the Russians have now almost entirely taken full control at this point. This means we continue to see them advancing. Komar, as mentioned, being the strategic last location, is currently under attack both from the south and from the direction of Udratne in the east. And there we've seen that the Russians essentially dropped leaflets on the last Ukrainian units stationed in the area, that the Russians who are trying to persuade them to surrender or retreat. That hasn't happened yet, but it's very clear that if Komar falls here in the southern region, it would lead to not having any Ukrainian military presence in the Donetsk region. Instead, the Russians would either advance further toward the center or pivot northward, where, after all, with Pokrovsk, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Siversk, there are still some cities, larger cities under Ukrainian control in Donetsk. And it's not only in Donetsk that the Russian advance continues, but also in Sumy in the northeast of the country. Here too we have new footage, Ukrainian recordings in this case, which show us that Russian soldiers are continuing to advance. This footage here is from the small town of Oleksivka. There are several Oleksivkas. We've just seen it on the Donetsk map. This is a different Oleksivka in Sumy, and we can clearly observe how the Russian soldiers are being targeted, but once again, it's solely from the air. We can clearly observe that a large drone, referred to as the Queen Hornet, is being actively deployed in this area, conducting attacks and repeatedly dropping different types of explosive devices. Interestingly, it immediately places explosives inside bottles for deployment. I think we'll explain that in a moment. These are relatively classic grenades being dropped, but also, well, quite makeshift, you could say almost homemade in nature. Now, here we see it, a kind of bottle, probably once drinking bottles that have been modified, where either a liquid or explosives have been packed inside. We also see the detonator attached on top. The Ukrainians are attempting to utilize these to strike the Russians. And what we're observing in these recordings is that Oleksivka has now completely fallen under Russian military control. They have also all been located. That means the southernmost part of this roughly 2-kilometer-long village from north to south is now under Russian control. And that means to us that the Russians have advanced further here, that there is no longer any presence of the Ukrainian army in Oleksivka, but that it is entirely under Russian control. And what we've been somewhat missing in the past few weeks are these Ukrainian counterattacks altogether. That means while we saw that at the beginning in Sumy, we remember Loknya and Basivka, where the Ukrainians were still attempting to push forward and force the Russians to retreat. From this region, we don't really see that anymore. We see the typical images that we also know from Donetsk and from the southern part of the country. The Russians are advancing further and further, and the Ukrainians are trying to use these drone drops from above to decimate them as much as possible. We're also taking a closer look at the map and can see that a relatively large area of nearly 200 square kilometers is currently under Russian control in Sumy. The footage we just saw from Oleksivka, we know that a strategic, perhaps the final key location, if you will, is Yanukivka, and it continues to remain firmly under Ukrainian control for the time being. But we also see here in the south that this is Sumy, and if we look at it the distance, then it's to the northern districts of Sumy. Up here we can see that it's still about 18 kilometers, and 18 kilometers is truly dramatic because it means that the Russians, with their Fiber-guided drones, along with other FPV drones, are entering the city. That means they can essentially hunt down and attack both Ukrainian civilians and soldiers within the city once they've successfully taken Oleksiivka under their command and started setting up their initial strategic positions there. For their drone teams, it's entirely feasible to fly these devices all the way into Sumy city. Sumy city currently has 250,000 residents still living there today. And so we see here that the situation is truly dramatic, and the Ukrainian army is also unable to halt the Russian offensive in Sumy in the northeast of the country. We also want to take a look at the whole situation on the big map to once again confirm that this is no longer so small, it's no longer just a few villages, but you can actually see it on the map. We remember the major Russian offensive last May, which was halted a year ago, was here in Vovchansk on one side and in Lipsy north of Kharkiv on the other. And if we take a closer look at those areas, they're roughly the same size as what's currently under Russian control north of Sumy. When compared to the Donbass, as well as Zaporizhzhia and Kherson in the south, it's still relatively small. But we can see it's slowly taking shape. The source here is Deep State Map, a pro-Ukrainian map provider. Nonetheless, we can observe that the Russians are situated far from the front lines, which we've seen in recent years, now advancing back into the northern region. We see that this entire blue area was once under Russian control. Kiev was heavily threatened from the northern front and, of course, from the eastern side as well. However, yes, there's now a threat of essentially a repeat of what was seen back then. Of course, much slower and far deadlier, it must be said, for all involved. Nonetheless, the Russians are essentially chewing their way back into Ukraine, also pushing forward from the northeast. We've discussed Donetsk, Sumy, and now we must also address Kharkiv there as well. The situation is becoming increasingly critical for the Ukrainian army. Here we have just a few propaganda victory shots from the Russians, specifically from Kindrashivka, and these shots don't really say much for now, they just show the typical stuff again. So you frequently choose a monument from the Great Patriotic War or World War II, position yourself in front of it, and strike a pose, trying to make the statement, look, this place is now under our control as well. But the very fact that they pose here and that the Russians can stand so calmly inspecting their own drone undisturbed, and now adjust their flags here with ease. This clearly demonstrates that Kindrashivka is now firmly under Russian control. And this location is situated, as we'll see on the map shortly. North of Kupiansk, this city that is heavily contested, and it shows the Russians are advancing further along the western bank of the Oskil River. This is also something we want to take a look at on the map. And we can now see here, as mentioned, the situation is critical, and for some experts and observers, it's not entirely understandable, because it's absolutely essential to remember this is Kupiansk, and it's clear. I'll try drawing a line here. This marks the Oskil River. That means this is the river that essentially served as a kind of front line and held as a front for a long time, and now the Russians are crossing it further and further and have managed to reach here, including Kindrashivka. We can see it here. Yeah, roughly, what is that? 8 kilometers advanced, specifically on the western side of the Oskil. And it's crucial to note, the Russians don't have any armored vehicles here. They don't have any tanks, and the only vehicles they're using are ones they've seized. This means that every single Russian, every soldier there has to either swim across the Oskil or make the journey in a small boat. They are regularly attacked by the Ukrainians. There are no functional bridges left here, and yet the Russians continue to advance on the west bank of the Oskil in the Kharkiv region. The issue for the Ukrainians is that while they're doing very well here with almost no front movement, the Russians are still on the east bank, the far more dangerous side, because the Ukrainians are dealing with much tougher logistics here. They managed to stop the Russians here, but they can't succeed further north. And there is a significant risk that if Kindrashivka is now captured, the Russians will push further westward and eventually succeed in outflanking Kupiansk entirely. We see a connecting road, the black one visible here, is already under Russian control. There are still two main roads heading south and west which remain firmly under Ukrainian control for now. So for now, it is still possible for Ukraine, so to speak. That means it is possible via Kupiansk, with the partially repaired bridges there, to maintain control over this entire area. But if the Russians continue to push forward, then not only is Kupiansk lost, but also this entire pocket here on the eastern bank of the Oskil River. Let's take a look at the Ukrainian Air Force's activities. They've grown significantly stronger recently. There are various reasons for this. For one, it is said that up to 20 F-16 fighter jets have allegedly arrived by now. Up to 60 were promised to Ukraine after all. And secondly, there's also the supply of weapons systems, especially bomb systems from the West, from France and the US, is significantly greater than last year. This has to do with President Biden having promised a lot of bombs, which are still arriving. President Trump is not delivering any new ones. We have footage here of a MiG-29 belonging to the Ukrainian Air Force. Here we see this specific tactic once again, the role that is being executed. Here, 1, 2, 3, 4 of these GBU-39 glide bombs are being released. The MiG-29 then immediately dives down again to get below the Russian radars and below their capability to intercept it, essentially flying down to evade. We can observe here, essentially, how it's flying back toward the west, while simultaneously deploying flares in every possible direction. And these are the recordings of ASM-250 bombs, French-manufactured bombs, hitting Chotkino. Chotkino is a city located in the Kursk region too, which the Ukrainians also made efforts to seize and control. A city right on the border, which they, however, could not capture. And now we see once again how buildings in Chotkino used by the Russian army are being attacked. There are probably still some civilians here, but not many, as the combat activities have been ongoing for quite some time now. And we see how Ukraine continues to maintain pressure, or at least tries to maintain it, in Kursk, while on the other side of the border, Sumy is being attacked. And finally, we see unique footage that tells the story of an aerial battle unlike anything seen before. Namely, an aerial battle that took place just yesterday, precisely in this region. It seems that the Ukrainians once again targeted Chotkino and other locations in Kursk with F-16 fighter jets, among other means. And the Russians sent a Su-35, a so-called super flanker, which was supposed to shoot down those F-16s. But the Su, or the pilot, didn't realize he had flown right into a well-planned ambush. At the same time as the F-16, reports indicate that a Swedish Saab 340A WACS system had already been tracking the approach from about 300 kilometers away, well before the Russians came close, and once they were near enough, an air defense missile, an MRAM from an F-16, was fired with a range of around 50 kilometers, and as a direct consequence, this Su-35 was successfully shot down and neutralized. We are now seeing the new footage. Here are two Ka-52 helicopters of the Russian army flying around the wreckage. I hope it's recognizable. Up there, the Ka-52, and down below, the Su-35 wreck. The Russians have admitted that it happened, and the wreckage is located near Koronevo, about 16 kilometers away from the border. Nonetheless, it was a truly unique air battle, and many are saying it has something to do with the Ukrainians now having the F-16s, which in a way could only detect attacks at close range and then have to defend themselves, but that they now have these AWACS aircraft produced in Sweden in operation, flying far behind the front, yet effectively monitoring Russian airspace from that position, and therefore provide pilots with the precise data needed to accurately fire their AIM-120. Air-to-air missiles at Russians, effectively shooting them down. Finally, we'd like to explore two unique aspects associated with fiber optic drones. One unique aspect is, of course, that the Ukrainians are now deploying these drones, enabling them to undermine or bypass even the most complex systems of the Russian military. In recent days, we've seen silos and storage facilities attacked, where drones moved around almost entirely without any restrictions. Now we're seeing something truly unique. The Russian army has, over the past few years, effectively managed to secure entire roads and supply routes they've relied on, essentially overlaying them with a net. This vast system above counters attacks from FPV drones which strike guided by remote, either wired or wireless. Now, it's the case that with these fiber optic guided drones, you can fly extremely close to the ground because the connection stays completely stable. You don't need radio signals, the drone just pulls the fiber optic cable behind it. And accordingly, it's now possible for the Ukrainians to fly into these streets, so to speak, from the side. Now we see it here through an entrance that's meant for cars. And now, here's the attack directly targeting a Buchanka truck or a small bus belonging to the Russian army. It seems that it actually worked. Here's the bus we just observed moments ago. The second drone is taking a look from above and can clearly observe, at least, the extent of what has essentially been achieved here. That means the Russians have, one might say, succeeded in persuading and urging the Ukrainians by extensively introducing this fiber optic technology. They didn't do it for long, nor did they want to, because these drones are also very expensive, even with fiber optic technology, and therefore now being able to, the Russians, with their sometimes very advanced logistics, though inconsistent, can still manage to launch attacks in certain front sections. And finally, we want to take a look at a Russian video, which, it must be said quite clearly, shows an absolute exceptional case. Namely, the actual exceptional case where you observe a drone flying by with a fiber optic cable attached and then cutting the cable behind it. That has never happened, as far as I recall, and it's not something systematic in any way. It's not a regular practice for the Russians, but rather a rare exception, as everything must align perfectly. Apparently everything lined up perfectly here. That means we're seeing Russians lying down, knowing that a Ukrainian drone will come this way any moment now. We're about to see them and essentially run into this drone. Here we see the drone. So this is a fiber optic guided drone. Down there we can clearly see that's an explosive charge from the RPG-7 launcher. We can see up there the battery attached, and on the side, though hard to spot, those are the 4 small rotors. The drone is flying in this direction, so following a path, and it's coming from over here. And the Russians know perfectly well that since it's coming from here, it must be trailing a cable behind it. And this cable, we'll see, the Russians are searching for it and will attack the drone. So they're essentially running out of their hiding spot as they weren't spotted. The drone also has a camera. And now, interestingly, they're searching the ground and are finding the cable of what is at least presumed to be a Ukrainian drone. Perhaps it's all propaganda footage on the ground. And now, interestingly, here we see it. They're essentially using a pair of scissors, a medical scissors. I hope you can see it clearly. This is the cable right here. And that's the scissors that are being used. Now the drone cuts through the cable. Moments later, it loses the connection and the operator can no longer control it. It consequently crashes and explodes. This entire scenario perhaps occurs only once in every 10,000 attacks from both sides. You have to be extremely lucky, or it's staged footage, that's also possible. In any case, to put it bluntly, that's practically the only effective way to stop a fiber optic guided kamikaze drone, by completely severing its connection to the operator. And that actually only works by cutting its cable.